Order, order, and welcome to the Environmental Audit Committee, where we are pleased to have two panels of experts giving oral evidence today on our first session on climate and security. We're going to have quite a tight programme today, so we're going to get straight on with it, and I'm particularly pleased to welcome joining us from, I think, both from the United States. I'd just like to ask you to introduce yourself and explain what your role is in relation to this subject with Dr. Kira Vinke from the German Council of Foreign Relations. Dr. Vinke.
Thank you so much. My name is Kira Vinke. I head the Center for Climate and Foreign Policy at the German Council on Foreign Relations. Thank you.
Thank you. And we're also joined by Erin Sikorsky from the Center for Climate and Security in the United States. Welcome.
Thanks so much. I direct the Center for Climate and Security, a research institute based in Washington, D.C. And prior to that, I led climate and environment analysis across the U.S. intelligence community.
Thank you. And in the chamber, we have Dr. Helen Adams from King's College.
Yeah, I'm a senior lecturer in disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation. Tend to work on climate-related migration and have worked on climate security in the context of the IPCC.
Terrific. I'm going to start, if I may, with Erin. From the perspective of the United States, could you give us a sense about how climate change is regarded as a security risk within the U.S. government?
Yes, thank you. It's an honor to be here. So the U.S. government has put climate change and national security at the front of its foreign and security policy agenda under the Biden administration, but really it's been a bipartisan issue for over a decade now, with the U.S. Congress integrating climate and security considerations into the National Defense Authorization Bill for many years, looking at it as a direct risk to the U.S. military, its installations, its resilience, its operations, but also a compounding risk to drive instability and risks of conflict in places that are of interest to U.S. national security. So the State Department, the U.S. Department of Homeland Security also have been involved in these conversations, really taking a whole of government approach led by the National Security Council, and with this administration, an executive order on tackling the climate crisis at home and abroad, really pushing for not just climate being considered in the climate office or the climate shop, right, at these institutions, but fully integrated into regional analysis. The regional combatant commands here in the U.S. are all taking a look at climate change and what it means for their regions that they focus on. They're integrating it into war games, right? Not seeing it as separate from geopolitical competition with China, for example, or the threat from terrorism, threat from Russia, but instead layering in a climate lens. There's still progress to be made for sure, but over the past decade or so, there's really been a shift towards a more fully integrated approach at looking at climate as a national security risk.
Does that also apply to domestic physical risk from climate to defense and security assets, critical national infrastructure, that kind of thing?
Yes, I think so, especially with the military, right? You've had disasters like Hurricane Michael a few years ago, which destroyed Tyndall Air Force Base on the Gulf Coast, causing billions of dollars of damage. You've had a great increase in the number of hours that the National Guard here in the U.S. is fighting wildfires, for example, in recent years. You've had atmospheric rivers in California interrupting military training. So I think within the military, domestically, absolutely. I think more broadly than that, the Department of Homeland Security and FEMA have been increasingly thinking about climate as a security risk domestically in terms of hazards to electrical infrastructure, other critical infrastructure, domestic migration as well as something to be thinking about. The Homeland Security Department's developed an entire climate security training for its personnel, which I think is a step in the right direction. I do think the military, though, domestically has really been leading the way here.
And do they consider climate risk as a threat multiplier across the other? You mentioned geopolitical risks. It's seen in that context. Is it seen in particular regions of the world where there are particular pressure points from climate change. Is that taken into account as an extra degree of risk?
It is. So the U.S. National Intelligence Community released a threat assessment on climate change, a national intelligence estimate that's public, it's unclassified, and in that it identified 11 countries and a couple regions of the world in which they see that threat multiplier challenge happening. And so I think they are integrating it there. And like I said, the combatant commands are as well. I do think one gap and place we've been pushing them is to not only look at places that are already at high risk, right? Like places like the Sahel, places like East Africa, which are already in crisis for a variety of reasons, not just climate change, right? But as we look 10 to 20 years down the road, there are going to be places that maybe are stable today where climate change will, again, intersect with other factors to tip things over into instability. And so I think we need to look more broadly. But yes, the U.S. absolutely is looking at it as a threat multiplier.
Thank you. I'm going to turn to Helen to discuss the UK for a moment. So how do you see climate risk as being, or climate security being regarded within risks for the UK government?
And I think we've got this one to me, I think as well, is something for the second panel where you've got the CCC and the Met Office as well. But from an academic perspective, I think you've got the humans. I think we're fairly good at looking at climate change as a human security risk. I think we've got quite a good framework for understanding how we need to adapt. I think the issue in the UK is that we're not meeting our own adaptation targets, and in that sense, we're leaving ourselves exposed to a lot of climate risks. I think from my perspective, risk comes a lot from vulnerability as much from the hazard. And so, yes, climate change is going to get worse, but actually whether or not a hazard becomes something terrible and destroys lives and destroys infrastructure actually depends on our levels of vulnerability. And I think a lot of our infrastructure, a lot of our systems are really under pressure now, even without climate change. And there's that big adaptation gap to fill that's really in our hands to fill. So a lot of it isn't about the climate getting worse. It's about us not, looking after our own people and our infrastructure.
Do you look across the UK sphere of influence within our overseas territories, for example?
I think the biggest thing is that climate change is undermining development gains. So in a lot of overseas territories, you're getting cyclone after cyclone or hurricane after hurricane, and a lot of lower income, smaller, I'm thinking about islands here, they're just recovering from one event after another, and you're actually not moving forward. They're running on the spot, if not going backwards in terms of development gains, and I think that's the biggest impact overseas.
Thank you. And just before I bring in Barry Gardner, who's got more international perspectives, could I ask Kira if you could just give us a quick overview of how the German government regards climate change risk in its security portfolios?
Yes, thank you. So the German government recently published its first national security strategy, and therein it's conceptualized three pillars of security, and one is sustainability, and therein it has outlined the threats of climate change, also the threats of biodiversity loss and the implications for food security. And this is also a whole of government approach to national security with also a human security lens. It regards climate change as a threat to national security. And also it has published a climate foreign policy strategy where also there is some links made to the question of climate security and the implications for German climate foreign policy and climate diplomacy going forward. Moreover, the German Defense Ministry has also published a strategy on how to adapt to climate change, also very recently. So there is a lot of movement in this area, I would say, and it is also seen as something that different levels of government need to pay attention to. So the security community, the foreign policy community, also the development community, especially when it comes to Germany's engagement with other countries abroad.
Thank you very much. Barry Gardner. Oh, sorry, Chris, you have a quick question.
You said the number of hurricanes was getting worse and worse, but I'm not doubting the importance of climate change, but the number of hurricanes is fewer than it was in the 19th century, isn't it?
I actually don't have the stats on that, so I can come back and answer it, but I wouldn't want to answer it off the cuff.
We had a Met Office inquiry.
In the next panel?
No, it was in a previous panel, and they gave a specific figure on that, which was quite shocking in terms of not just the frequency, but also the severity of the hurricanes and the statistical probability of that.
Let's hold that question for the Met Office when they joined us in the next panel. Barry Gardner, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Clearly, climate change is posing a number of risks that you've outlined, security risks, and those can be divided into short-term risks, which a state considers immediately, and also long-term risks. I want to try and get you to distinguish between those, but also in comparing, if one looks at the UK, Dr. Adams, you've just outlined that by and large we're trying to get on with coping with the human risks from climate change, and then we've got the strategic engagement with the rest of the world to ensure that those longer term strategic risks don't impact on us adversely. But what I want to ask you is, and I think I'd probably put this to Dr. Sikorsky first, which countries actually can see a benefit to themselves in climate change, whether that is a relative benefit in comparison with other countries or a total overall benefit, and therefore may be less disposed to engage in aiding a long-term solution?
Thank you for the question. And to clarify, I'm not a doctor. I don't want to compare myself to Dr. Vinke or Dr. Adams here. But I think in terms of, who benefits from climate change, I would argue that every country will see negative repercussions if we continue on a trajectory of warming that we're currently on. Sometimes in the popular press, you will see Russia held up as a beneficiary because of the melting Arctic, because of a longer potential growing season. But I'll note that before Russia invaded Ukraine, President Biden, in a public address talking to President Putin, said something along the lines of, one of the biggest risks you face is a burning tundra that will never freeze again. So even Russia, right, the fact that the Arctic is melting, that the permafrost is melting, they have critical infrastructure that is on that permafrost that is being destroyed, energy infrastructure.
Well, indeed, sorry to interrupt you, Ms. Corsi, sure. But indeed, this committee has already, in its subcommittee, its polar subcommittee, looked at the opening up of the northern flank for Russia and the strategic implications of that. So you would, by and large, you would say everybody is going to lose, and therefore everybody has something to gain from cooperating in long-term political, diplomatic ways of managing the problem.
Yes, I agree with that. I think there are opportunities, though, as well for countries in that cooperation to lead that cooperation, to build alliances with countries being hurt by climate change on the front lines. I think there's geopolitical opportunity for the UK and the US to lead. Yeah,
you've talked about that previously, where you said China is eager to try to take advantage of a divide between the global north and global south concerning climate finance. So looking at that specifically, and looking at COP29 and the negotiations on the new collective quantified goal on climate finance, what weight do you believe the global north, the US, the UK, the European Union should be placing on getting that agreement at COP29?
I think it's a huge opportunity for the global north to show to the south that we are going to live up to our commitments, that we're going to provide those resources, not because it's the right thing to do necessarily, but because it is a benefit to the global north in its geopolitical position, because, you know, investing in stability and resilience and adaptation in these countries prevents future conflict, prevents risks of overwhelming climate migration, right? I think it gets ahead of those long-term risks you were talking about by making that investment today, and it strengthens our position geopolitically, again, from a U.S. perspective, as we think about China.
Thank you. Dr. Vinke, your reflections on the most effective ways in which we could be encouraging that global cooperation on climate security.
Thank you. I think also tying back to your previous question, we need to look at planetary security and at dealing with concrete climate impacts. So this is how I would differentiate between the long term and the short term. When it comes to planetary security, as Erin Sikorsky said, all countries will be affected. And of course, we have special interests groups that may gain from prolonged fossil fuel use. However, territories, populations will be affected across countries. And of course, there's differential effects on different populations, marginalized communities, for example. And it is important to take into account that we have these diverse geographic differential impacts. So we have very strong impacts in the tropics. We have impacts in regions that are already arid that may become more arid or see increased variability in the rainfall. And this means that the cooperation needs to target, in particular, countries that are most vulnerable and may see further displacement of people, may also see people trapped in places where they cannot move out of harm's way. And to encourage this, I think also connecting the humanitarian development and peace nexus to the climate agenda will be very important going forward, and to engage with joint trainings on this, be it in the NATO, be it on a bilateral basis, in both the hard security sector and also in the foreign policy sector, could be means of engagement.
Well, I'm most interested in the foreign policy security sector, and there are key factors which are likely to cause conflict, whether those are from famine, whether they're from water shortage, whether they're from disputes over water. We know what those are. So how should we be prioritizing our diplomatic engagement to make sure that we create as much stability in those areas as possible?
So I would say mitigation, adaptation, migration policies. So I think our first line of defense, so to say, is mitigation. This goes domestically as well as engaging through the COP process, through bilateral engagements for more ambitious climate protection, because there are limits to adaptation if we go above 2-degree warming and even above 1.5 degrees, especially for the UK overseas territories and other very exposed regions. Then on the adaptation agenda, this is both specific climate adaptation, but also classical development policies. Yeah, so to increase the resilience of a community, increase trust building in communities, good governance. Yeah, so these are all factors, but also of regions that may become uninhabitable or where risks are very high, to enable people to move safely out of harm's way. For example, also better management of internal migration. Today, the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center released a new report on the displacement numbers of 2023. This is very concerning that we see both on the disaster side and on conflict such high numbers of displacement. And this pressures will increase with rising climate impacts. And therefore, we need stronger engagement on this issue.
What impact has the Sendai framework had on that, though?
Last question, Mary.
I mean, we have seen progress in disaster risk preparedness globally, and also infrastructural preparedness, but also communal response mechanisms. However, in the long term, what we're seeing is maybe it will not be able to keep up with the rising climate impacts. And this is due to the nonlinear nature of climate change, that the impacts may not just continue gradually as warming increases, as we put more CO2 and other greenhouse gas into the atmosphere, but rather we may see sort of rapid changes, large-scale disasters that then we do not have the adequate frameworks for. So I think it is a good framework. We have made improvements that have saved people's lives. This is very evident. However, more is needed.
Thank you very much. Anna Morin.
Thank you. Can I turn to you, Dr. Adams? So in our request for evidence from this, we asked government departments to submit the policy strategies, papers that each department had on looking at security risks on climate change. Not all of them came back to us, but from looking at it, it all seems quite bitty across government. We know that, for example, the Prime Minister got rid of the role of climate envoy within the FCDO, which was a cross-government role. And we know that there are different strategies for each department, but what I would like to know from you is, what is your view on the current government's policy towards security risk from climate change? Do you think it's adequate, and what would you like to see?
I think one of the biggest things, I suppose, when I was part of the Cabinet Office for COP26 and led on science engagement for COP26, and I think part of that work, what we were trying to do was to think differently about how we communicate risk in government, and this idea that you have this, it's completely separate the kind of, we know the severe risks that climate change is going to pose to normal functioning of life in the UK, the economy, jobs, well-being. It's going to kill people, but yet not acting at that scale, right? And so it's why is that not happening? And so I think, this isn't answering your question yet, but I think the first thing is that back then things weren't getting high enough level. So things like the IPCC were stopping at quite a low level. Even things like the CCC and the climate change risk assessment weren't getting to the higher level, and that information wasn't being delivered in a way that it reached that top level that you could have an all-of-government approach to it. So I don't know. I mean, you've got things like, the Climate Resilience Board that's just been set up, and I don't know whether that offers a potential now to have that kind of cross-government coordination and that ability to kind of deal with climate intelligence and respond in a kind of holistic way. But I think that's, what do I want to see? I want to see climate change information being presented. And I think it's also on our side a bit in the way we present climate information. We're not presenting it in a way consistent. Even though we all know how severe the impacts are, we're not presenting it in a way that is, right, this is what you care about in your ministry, and this is what you need to be thinking about. And so they're two separate worlds, basically.
And ensuring, because currently the disjointed nature of it means that the departments are working in silos quite often. How do you ensure that there's a coming together of the government focusing on this issue?
Not in government. I mean, for me,
I'd like to see
it has to come from the top down, and there has to be structures in place. And I think it's basically kind of what Erin was talking about in having it. I mean, we've been talking about mainstreaming climate change for a very long time, but it has to be, thinking about this session, climate change isn't a security risk in of itself, right? It's a security risk because it impacts on everything that we're doing. And I think Erin's response in terms of what they're doing in the US, in terms of every single decision we make, has to have a climate component in it. Yeah. But then I think you've also got to avoid that then becoming tick box, all right? So every decision we make, we have to make sure we think about ethics, we have to make sure we think about, equity and diversity, and every decision we make, we have to think about climate, and then it becomes a bit tick box. But I think there come some of the steps you can take. But I think it's got to come top down, and I think to do that, we've got to make sure that these key climate findings are taken on board, because we've got to deliver them in a way that's about which is why this session's so great, actually. It's not about the hazards, right, or the risks. It's about what does this mean for the things we care about. And I think we've got to get better at that.
Thank you. Can I turn to you, Erin? and just ask, so you opened the session talking about what Biden had done in the US, and we saw Biden come in and instigate this rapid climate and security assessment. Can you tell us how the UK's approach compares to the US and perhaps other countries? How does it compare in terms of the grasp of the issue?
Within 1 minute, please, Erin. We're very up.
Sure. No, understood. I think the UK's grasp of the issue, what I have seen, and you see this in many countries, is the analysis of the risk is there, but it's the moving to action part where the gap is. And I think one of the biggest challenges is building a national security workforce that is climate literate and climate strong, right? So that it's not just from the top down, but you've got the middle managers, frankly, the 1- and 2-star generals in the military who understand why climate's important, how it makes their job easier to bring a climate lens. You're not just asking them to do one more thing, right? But they can integrate it. And I think it's that education and workforce building piece that will make this stick.
Yeah, that's good.
Okay.
Thank you. And I'm afraid we're under real pressure. Chris, we're going to have to take Clive. We've got 2 more sets of questions coming. Clive, yes.
Who's best placed to give us a very brief definition of the term cascading risks and tipping points in the context of security, climate change and security? Who would like to have a stab at that?
I'm happy to.
Please do.
I feel strongly about the term tipping points, so I'll start with that one. I think tipping points has become a bit popular with very little basis, and I don't think it's that useful in terms of driving policy because it's not that well defined. I think in the security world, people lazily use it as a kind of synonym for mass migration triggering conflict without any understanding or a reference to the causal mechanisms that might lead to that happening, right? And social processes don't often happen as a tipping point, right? Social processes. So like migration and conflict are always called social tipping points, right? But they don't just emerge from nowhere, right? They emerge from, as these guys have already said, the kind of political, the governance, the poverty, the vulnerability. And so I think a tipping point in the social system would be, a rapid change due to, for example, terrorism or an increase, social instability. And that's how it's used, but I think it's lazy and not very useful in terms of understanding why those things are happening and trying to stop them.
I can see very quickly on this. I don't want to take too long on this. I haven't got long, but please do jump in, Dr. Vinke and Erin.
Yeah, thank you so much. I just want to add to what was said, because climate tipping points in this climate science community are a little bit different from the social tipping points that you have just referred to. And just to go into that a little bit more. So in climate science, we talk about climate tipping with regards to sort of large-scale elements in the Earth system that appear to be relatively stable, but that can sort of or be relatively well dealing with the different anthropogenic pressures from climate change, but also other factors. But that can then rapidly and irreversibly transition into a new equilibrium. So, for example, tropical coral reefs, they face, for example, after a certain threshold of both acidification of the ocean and heating, both related to CO2 emissions, they face thresholds after which they face mass bleaching events and then die off, and then they are not sort of coming back from this. We have seen this in parts of the Great Barrier Reef already. And if these mass bleaching events occur several times, then the reef is irreversibly dead. And these types of tipping elements were very different in nature. They are in different world regions and have a global effect, so to say. And they are also interlinked. So they can have influences. For example, if the Greenland ice sheet crosses a tripping threshold, then this has an influence to various other parts of the Earth system.
Which brings us on to cascades, which is
Exactly.
where one thing happens and then that leads to another and another and another, and a cascade effect. So really, thank you for that. The question I wanted to ask is, surely if we are as policymakers going to protect and I can see the term here, kind of UK interests. I'm thinking about people. People. If we're to protect people, then is it necessary to maybe implement specific human rights and invoke people's human rights to be protected by their governments against cascade effects, against tipping points, against the impacts of climate change and the implications that may have? Is that something that policymakers should be thinking about? Because I know very recently, I think Client Earth won a High Court case where they said that they won the case because the UK government's climate strategy was not seen as fit for purpose and therefore breaches the UK Climate Change Act. So I just think, do you think there's a role for policymakers there to protect people's human rights from these cascade events, from these tipping points?
Yes, I do think so. We have on the UN level, we now have the right to a safe and clean environment, healthy environment. This is one human right, but there's also others that are under risk from climate change, the right to life, for example. This health risks that stem from climate change, especially the high impacts that may result from cascading risk, but also just impacts that we're seeing now. So heat waves, and there's another case from the Swiss climate seniors that their health was detrimentally affected. And this was considered to be, a violation of their rights.
No, thank you, Dr. Vinke. Thank you for that. Just very quickly, Dr. Adams, if you could just come in from a UK perspective on human rights as well.
Yeah, I was just going to say, just agree with Kira that I don't think cascading risks are a real issue, especially when we're talking about UK in the context of the international. Why should we act? Of course, we need to act because actually the UK. And also, why should we act tonight? Why should we cooperate? It's because the UK can't insulate itself from international cascading risks. I don't think you have to invoke cascading risks or tipping points to make the argument you're making about the need to protect, human security. Because even just a normal heat wave, you get thousands and thousands of excess deaths.
Thank you. Claudia Webb. And just before you start, it looks as though the business in the House is reaching a conclusion. So I'm going to swap over for Chris Grayling to take over the chair. So I'd just like to thank you for your attendance today, particularly from the US. And Claudia Webb's got the last set of questions for this panel.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. It seems to me that countries in the Global South in particular are spending more per head on servicing international debt than they are on meeting the needs of their civilians in relation to climate change. Could I just ask, if I might, this question to Dr. Vinke, if I might. You are an expert on climate change and migration. Could you explain the relationship between the two?
Yes, so human migration, as many human actions, is driven by various factors. So there's economic drivers, there's environmental drivers, there's security drivers of migration, and usually it's a decision of a variety of factors that people take whether they move or not. And climate change can influence these types of drivers. For example, by deteriorating the security of a country, by decreasing food security, by depleting economic financial resources, etc., of a household. And then also the household's individual decision, which may again be a variety of personal factors, the setup of the household, etc., the availability of networks and places of arrival, may then be a decisive factor in whether a person decides to move or stay under pressures of climate change. So even under very severe pressures of climate change, some people may decide to stay because they feel very place attached to where they live. And also some people may not be able to move because they have such high financial constraints, or they are not able to leave their household for other reasons. So it is an intricate matter, but there's very strong evidence that there are links between climate change and the drivers of migration, and that people are moving, especially when there's disaster and it's a threat of life and death.
Thank you. I can see that Dr. Sikorsky would like to come in. Please do.
Thank you. I just wanted to briefly highlight 3 security risks we see stemming from climate migration. And I want to note, though, that it's not the migrants themselves that are the security risk, but instead it's the strain on governance and resources within countries, developing countries that they're migrating, often from rural to urban areas. That can be a risk. A second risk is destabilizing reactive political responses to those migrants, as we've seen in the global north. And then the third is that the weaponization of migration by political factors or countries as well is a real problem. But I think, we have evidence here in the United States from USAID that investments in helping communities stay, when they can, making investments in agriculture, for example, can reduce the desire to migrate. They've looked at Honduras in particular, where they've interviewed folks who've gotten funds from USAID for agriculture and found that those folks' desire to migrate is much less than the rest of the country. So it's a place where those adaptation and resilience investments, I think, can make a real difference in many places, and we need to focus more on that.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Can I just ask Dr. Adams, this committee has received mixed evidence, really, in terms of the impact of population mobility on the UK in particular, induced by climate change. What is your assessment?
I think, just to follow up from these guys' responses, I think it's useful to think about climate-related migration in 3 categories, because I think you've got climate-related migration that happens more slowly, where it's part of a decision-making process. Then you've got climate-related resettlement, where, say, you've got people living on the coast, there's managed realignment, you have to move people out of harm's way. And then you've got climate-related displacement, where there's a hurricane and you're going to move to save your life and then come back. And they've got very different, the climate in them it's got different. Obviously, when there's a cyclone, that was the climate, right? Whereas when a farmer moves, it could have been the climate, it could have been in agricultural policies. We don't know the different elements. And then with resettlement, again, very much the climate, but there's a longer time scale. So sometimes I think when we talk about climate-related mobility, it's good to break them down because they've got different drivers. In terms of the UK, I think the consensus is most people aren't coming near the UK from the regions that are affected. So in that sense, the climate-related factors are going to be generally become more at the forefront in this kind of migration decision-making process. But most of those decisions are happening, in West Africa, or they're happening, and those people aren't going to come near the UK. They'll go to countries that are next door, for example. I think where you have international migration to the UK that is starting to have more of a kind of climate signal in that decision-making, I think the way I look at it is that you're getting calls from the private sector that we have serious skills gaps. You're getting calls from various industries that we have labour shortages. And I think the risk is that we have politicised migration too much, such that we're not able actually to leverage the benefits of it for the UK when we actually have skills shortages and labour shortages. So I think I just worked on a report with the International Organisation of Employers, about kind of the need for kind of green borders in a way. Even if you think about linking it to climate change and the net zero transition, we don't have the skills for the net zero transition. Where are those skills going to come from? And they're going to come in part from migration. But then I think on that discussion, you then really need to have a just transition lens, right? So you think about Port Talbot, and that didn't need to happen. That something could have been in place to ensure that those people, if we knew that was coming, with the net zero transition, people can't just be losing their jobs and then displaced internally, or lose their jobs and then see them replaced by people coming in and migrants. So I think we've got to have a lens on the just this idea of leaving no one behind. There's not much out there on intra-urban or intra-UK migration. There's a lot more in the US, and I think it's about leveraging the opportunities of that. So if people are going to leave places on the coast because they get too risky or due to erosion, thinking ahead, thinking where could they go, which towns need those people, and kind of planning for that migration. And as I think it was Erin said, having these safe and orderly routes that people can migrate to different places.
Is that sort of saying that the UK doesn't have much to worry about when it comes to migration caused because of displacement and climate change in other countries. And the UK doesn't even need to plan for it. Is that where we're at?
I think we need to plan for it. I don't think to me it's a missed opportunity rather than a threat. If we don't plan for it, if we're not thinking about receiving populations, if we're not thinking about increases in population, the stress, I think Kira mentioned it, the stress that migrants may put on schools, and, obviously when new people come in, you need to think about where they're going, you need to think about social cohesion, we need to, we live in a country now where...
But what you're saying is that if there is devastation elsewhere, that the first port of call for people displaced by that devastation is more neighbouring countries than it is the UK.
100%.
And therefore the UK...
I'm going to draw it to close now because we're coming to 3 o'clock and we've got to have time to do the second session. Dr. Adams, Dr. Vinke, Dr. Sikorsky, thank you very much. I would have challenged you more about hurricane numbers, and that because I think biodiversity loss is much more significant. The number of hurricanes has fallen, the number of serious storms has fallen, but biodiversity loss is becoming an acute problem, but that's for another day. To all of you, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for
we'll
having
bring
us.
this session to a close and bring on panel 2. Order.
Thank you.
The proceeding is currently suspended. 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 The proceeding is currently suspended.
Second panel for our climate change and security investigation. We're joined by Baroness Brown of Cambridge, Richard Millar both of the Adaptation Committee of the Climate Change Committee, Professor Stephen Belcher, Chair of Science and Technology at the Met Office, Professor Jim Hall, and Margaret Reid from the National Infrastructure Commission. So, Professor Belcher, since you're in the middle, can I start with you? But I'm going to ask each of you how your organisations feed into the UK government's approach to understanding and addressing the security risks in the broadest sense posed by climate change. Can I ask you if you'd
thank you for the question. So, yes, Stephen Belcher, Chief Scientist at the Met Office. You'll be aware of the Met Office's weather forecasts, I hope, and our app, but we also have responsibility for looking at past climate internationally, but particularly for the UK, and then future climate, again, globally, but particular relationship for the UK. So we have a whole range of services related to that, which I hope we can come to.
Baroness Brown.
Thank you very much, and thank you for asking us to appear today. I chair the Adaptation Committee of the Climate Change Committee. The Climate Change Committee is a statutory advisor to government, in fact all 4 governments in the UK, on climate change, both mitigation and the committee I chair, which is the Adaptation Committee. We were established under the Climate Change Act, and our statutory obligations are to advise the UK government on the 5-yearly climate change risk assessments, and for the last 2 of those and for the forthcoming one, it has asked us to oversee the preparation of the independent evidence report on which that is based as well, and also every 2 years to review the UK's progress in delivering its national adaptation plan.
Thank you. Professor Hall.
Yes, good afternoon, and thanks for the invitation to join you. The National Infrastructure Commission is the government's impartial and independent advisors on long-term infrastructure strategy. So that spans across 6 economic sectors: energy, transport, water and wastewater, flood risk management, digital communications and waste. We look to the long term, conduct 5-yearly national infrastructure assessments, of which the most recent one was published last October. And the goals we work to are set by government and to support economic growth across the regions and prepare for net zero and significantly for this conversation, prepare for resilience in many senses.
Thank you very much. I'll come to Richard Millar and Margaret Reid as well in a moment, but can I ask you, perhaps Professor Hall, I can ask you this, because one of the things we didn't really touch on in the first panel was the practicality. I mean, the reality is for the UK, if nobody else does anything about climate change, we are badly affected, and the implications for the UK are significant. Infrastructure is one of the key areas where that could be the case. What other organisations involved in infrastructure development and planning for the future do you think play a significant role in this work, and how do you collaborate together with those who run the infrastructure, those who plan the infrastructure? How do you work together?
Yeah, well, you're absolutely right that infrastructure is very much central to this conversation because it provides essential services to us and it also supports supply chains and all sorts of other essential economic activities. Infrastructure has a series of design standards, planning arrangements, all of which are regulated to a greater or lesser extent within this country. Climate change is only partially incorporated in those long-term planning processes as they exist at the moment. At one end of the spectrum, the water sector has now adopted a standard of planning for a drought with an annual probability of 0.2%, a 1 in 500 year drought. That is one instance of a long-term target for what the sector is now planning to. But across other infrastructure sectors, we're not seeing the same degree of consistent planning and direction to achieve particular targets and standards. And within the Commission, we argue that without that type of very focused and measured approach in terms of what standards are to be expected, we're not going to see the level of consistent action that we need.
Professor Belcher, to what degree do organisations involved in looking forwards to planning in the public sector come to you for advice?
A huge range. I mean, as Jim has already alluded to, climate change is affecting everything about our lives, and therefore many government departments have roles and responsibilities around responding to those challenges. And therefore one of the roles of the Met Office is to firstly have records of past climate in the UK, so the National Climate Information Centre. So that's a resource that departments and industry draw upon. And then we also provide the climate projections for the UK, which are the sort of authoritative source of advice upon which, for example, the climate change risk analysis is based. So in that sense, the Met Office data underpins a whole raft of public and private sector thinking.
Mr. Millar, Baroness Brown, what would you say are the greatest risks the government should be prioritising?
Well, I'll kick that one off. We highlighted in our last advice on the last climate change risk assessment, we highlighted food security, both in terms of the quality and the impact of climate on our agricultural production in the UK, but also the issues of supply chains and the impacts that we see from the work the Met Office does on climate change internationally, the impacts on the places that much of our food is grown, because we all import, what is it, about half of our food, and of course a lot of our fresh fruit and vegetables. So food security is an important one, and with that comes land, and of course land use planning is a crucial part of that. There's also, and National Infrastructure Commission, and Jim will talk about this, we also highlighted the challenge of the changing climate to our power system, and particularly as we move towards net zero and we become more and more dependent on electricity as our main source of energy. It's a minority source of energy for us at the moment. By 2050 it becomes our majority source of energy, so it is absolutely crucial that our electricity infrastructure, for example, is built and designed to be very, very strongly resilient to what the climate can throw at us. There is, of course, also the health impacts of the changing climate, whether that's, as we heard in the last session, whether that's things like increasing number of heat-related deaths or heat-related illnesses, or whether, of course, it's the new pests and diseases that the changing climate will bring. They've been fumigating in Paris to get rid of mosquitoes carrying dengue fever. It won't be long before we have them here with the way the climate is changing. So, how we build our towns and cities, how we prepare our communities to be resilient, and, of course, how resilient is our business and our finance system to the changes of climate change. And also something which we think is absolutely critical is the issue of interdependencies and ensuring that different parts of our society understand what and who they are dependent on and how resilient the people that they are dependent on are, because that crucially determines how resilient they are.
Mr. Millar, do you think the government actually is taking into account in its climate change planning the security issues adequately or at all?
I think there's elements of it there. So we've provided a recent assessment of the most recent National Adaptation Programme, which is the plan the government has to produce in response to the climate change risk assessment. We provided that earlier this year, and we highlighted that it's a step forward in many of these aspects that Baroness Brown noted. However, we still think there are areas where it's falling short. And some of the areas that we think are most critical are around some of the areas that Professor Hall highlighted about setting out a clear goal and objective for what we're really trying to achieve to be climate resilient, so that the government can more effectively focus on the delivery side of it. I think we'd say across the board we're seeing more inclusion of adaptation, these considerations around climate risks to aspects of security in planning of policies. But the key bit where we think more needs to be done is the delivery of adaptation on the ground that is having demonstrable effects in actually reducing the exposure and vulnerability of people and places around the UK to some of these climate security risks.
Thank you. Erin.
Could I just add very quickly to that? I mean, we are seeing more and more mention of it. So, for example, in the National Security Risk Assessment, we see a lot of mention of climate change. In the integrated review, it's flagged up as a key topic. Yes. But as Richard says, there's plenty of more times that we're seeing it mentioned. It's actually the implementation and action where we're still absolutely lacking.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Belcher. If I could direct my question towards you. It would be great if we had a crystal ball, but obviously we don't. But, I would like to just delve a little bit more into the work and the projections of the Met Office for the frequency of extreme weather events, such as flooding, droughts, heat waves and wildfires, but not just in the UK, but in the overseas territories as well.
Okay.
Thank you. I know it's a wide spectrum I've given you there.
Yes, thank you very much. It sounds like my whole career and all of my colleagues. Just to give some context, remind ourselves that 2023 was the warmest global mean temperature on record at 1.45 degrees and 0.3 degree warmer than the previous. So we're really in the throes of climate change right now. Thinking about extremes in the UK, you mentioned heat waves, and it's virtually certain that heat waves have increased in the UK as a result of climate change, and I use this term virtually certain in a statistically robust sense. Members will remember the 2022 July heat wave when temperatures breached 40 degrees for the first time, and that was extremely likely, again I use that term in the proper sense, to be occurred without climate change. And if I could just divert briefly on that one, there were many impacts of that heat wave in July 2022, but one was there was heat stress on a data centre near London. That data centre then prevented some health trusts from getting their health records. So it's a really interesting example of, I think, a previously unthought of cascading risk, as was talked about earlier. So as we see these events happening, we're getting a real-time story about what climate change is giving us. If we can then say how often those are going to happen into the future, that's a useful way of thinking about impacts in the future. If I could just mention then briefly rainfall, we have seen increased rainfall. Rainfall is much more variable in the UK, so it's much harder to see a signal. But there is evidence, despite that winters in the UK, for example, are 12% wetter than they were in the 1960s to the 1990 period. So we have robust evidence of that, and indeed that the extremely wet days have increased. On rainfall, the headline message from climate change is hotter, drier summers, warmer, wetter winters, and that's consistent with what we've seen. However, the new evidence is showing us that although it's hotter, drier summers, when it does rain in the summer, we're likely to see very increased downpours of very heavy rainfall. So it's a subtle picture on rainfall. Can I just mention sea level rise, because that's not a topic that is often talked about, but in a health analogy, if a heat wave is a heart attack, maybe sea level rise is the high blood pressure that's the secret killer. It's that slow, pervasive change that we're seeing. So it's 17 centimetres higher since records began early 20th century. Huge range of outcomes for the end of this century, but of course many impacts associated with flooding. And then finally, on overseas territories, say for example in the Caribbean, we mentioned hurricanes earlier. What we do see in hurricanes, and we can attribute to climate change, is an increase in the rainfall associated with those hurricanes, although the numbers are very uncertain to say what's happening there, but the intensity going up, and clearly there's a responsibility to protect British interests overseas in those kind of areas.
Thank you. I'll just pick up and ask Margaret Reid, in relation to sea level rise, are we thinking carefully enough, for example, in planning a next generation Thames barrage and similar projects around the country about sea level rise?
I think the Thames Estuary 2100 strategy is actually really good as an example of adaptive planning, because what they've been doing is working out when they need to monitor and look at the state of the assets, and not just the Thames Barrier, but all the other assets that make up that defence for that estuary. And they've already worked out that they're going to need to bring forward some of those decisions. So in some areas, it's working really well. I think in others, there's a way to go. And the Environment Agency is doing some work called the Long-Term Investment Strategies, which is thinking about those kind of things for other areas of the country.
If I might just jump in briefly on the coastal infrastructure question, because I think that the big ticket stuff, the Thames Barrier, also coastal nuclear plants and so on, there's very careful consideration of the effects of sea level rise there, and adaptive strategies ready to move on an appropriate lead time. I think the issue is much more to do with smaller pieces of infrastructure, pieces of, for example, rarely used or not significantly used railway line along the coast, of which there are several, coastal towns which are protected by seawalls, which would be very costly to replace an upgrade. So that's the type of chronic threat which I think we need to pay attention to on the coast.
Were you done?
I'm done. Yep. Well, thank you.
Caroline Lucas.
Thank you, Chair. If I could come to Baroness Brown and pick up the issue around UK readiness, I wonder if you could say a little bit more about what your assessment is of how well prepared the UK is to deal with the security risk posed by climate change.
Well, I think we are concerned that we are not very ready at all, and I think the recent challenges with hot summers and flooding have shown that we're not very ready. For example, on that an important issue of food security, we lack a targeted strategy and indeed targets for ensuring that agriculture remains productive. We have an opportunity of that in the still developing environmental land management system that was brought in through the Environment Act, but that is not yet particularly specific about ensuring that our land remains properly productive and our soil remains supporting farmers to ensure our soil remains properly healthy. We don't require any sort of reporting by large private food companies on their supply chain risks, other than the ones who will be reporting as listed companies under the Task Force on climate-related financial disclosures. But that reporting on physical risks is normally very poor and doesn't really give us much help. The government does have something called the Adaptation reporting power, by which it can mandate critical suppliers to report on their adaptation reporting, but that's only been used as a mandatory power once, and every 5 years we encourage the government to use that as a mandatory power to find out
When you say it's only been used once, sorry, do you mean, can you just explain that was used on one...
It's only been used the very first time after the Climate Change Act was passed as a mandatory power to require critical infrastructure providers to report on their preparedness for climate change.
Do we know why it's not been used more often?
I think the government, understandably, doesn't like to impose more bureaucracy on companies, but on the other hand, it is a really crucial tool that the government has for finding out about the preparedness of things like our supply chains and our infrastructure. And we are encouraging them, actually, that we should be broadening it to local government and things like that as well. So, you know, I could go through a long list of, but there are a lot of areas where we would highlight that we are not well enough prepared. But we would also highlight that because for adaptation in the UK, we actually have no targets to say this is what a well-adapted UK would look like. It's actually very hard to know whether we are travelling fast enough and whether we are going in the right direction. So what we really feel most strongly about it is that we lack a vision with objectives and targets so that everybody can tell where we are in terms of our path.
That would be one of your main recommendations, that
yes.
we need those targets.
Yes.
Thank you. Yes, sorry.
I was just going to add to that, we also don't know the costs of adaptation, and that's one of the things that was very clear when we did our second national infrastructure assessment, and we suggested that companies needed to cost adaptation, particularly for infrastructure, and then report it through mandatory reporting under the adaptation reporting power.
Thank you. Let's to come to Professor Hall. The National Infrastructure Commission makes a large number of recommendations in your second infrastructure assessment. Which would you highlight as being most important to take forward in the context of climate?
In the context of climate and adaptation, we're going to repeat ourselves now, I'm afraid, because it is this question of establishing the long-term adaptation goal and targets. As Margaret has said, that needs to be based on costing, and so that there has to be some trade-off between risk and cost, but unless we fully understand what the costs are going to be, we can't arrive at what the appropriate level of adaptation might be. But that will enable us to set those targets and then monitor progress. It's also worth highlighting that a lot of this for infrastructure is managed through regulatory settlements, so the periodic price reviews which are done for the regulated utilities. And it's really important that we get this embedded as soon as we can, because in the period 2025 to 2030, there will be 400 billion of infrastructure expenditure will be agreed upon within those regulatory settlements. And we think it's really important that adaptation is embedded within those investments, because these sorts of things obviously are much cheaper to do if you do them up front when you're planning to do something, rather than having to go back and do costly retrofits.
Yep. I want to come back to Baroness Brown just for a second and talk about governance and accountability in a way, because who either individually or corporately is ultimately responsible for putting measures in place to ensure the UK's security from climate change risks? And do you think, for example, we should rethink quite a lot of the governance within Whitehall, and could the Cabinet Office, for example, be tasked with having more of an overview of all of this? Is it too piecemeal, I suppose, is my question.
And I think we heard in the previous session that comment about it being piecemeal, and we would very strongly agree with that. So, for example, for the climate change risk assessment and the National Adaptation Plan, that sits with DEFRA. But for the National Risk Assessment, that sits with the Cabinet Office. But of course, a lot of dealing with much of this, and of course, community resilience sits with local government. And then, of course, a lot of this is dependent on planning, which sits with DLUC. So just about every government department has some needs to act on climate change. And as you mentioned, you didn't get responses from all of them. No. And that's exactly what we find as well. So it's slightly encouraging to hear that you struggled on the Climate Change Committee. So we would like to see some more much better coordination of this, and I'm afraid we think it needs to be in a much more influential department than DEFRA. They work very hard on this in DEFRA, but actually it's not a department that has a huge influence over some of the other departments. So my personal view, I think the Cabinet Office might be a good place to put an overview in, but actually you might also say, well, we should look at DESNE's, Department of Energy Security and Net Zero, because there are an awful lot of interactions between adaptation and mitigation, and it might be appropriate to put the coordination in that department. The Institute for Government recently produced a report where actually they provided a very large number of options, but it does need that much stronger coordination, and my personal view is that one central place to coordinate across government, i.e. the Cabinet Office, would be a good place to put it.
And so, Professor Belcher, which government departments does your organisation work with most on these issues?
Yeah, well, we have a particular responsibility in DEFRA around the climate change risk assessment, and they sponsor the production of the UK's climate projections, which we update periodically to give the best possible information. I would say that information comes with an authority and a peer review. For example, Jim Hall was on the review panel for it. But at the moment, there is no quality assurance of data that is used in climate change, and so it's not the Met Office's data that is uniformly used. We do a lot of work, of course, with Department for Energy Security and Net Zero around energy security and future climate, particularly with the reliance on the renewable sector as well, and FCDO for overseas interests. And then finally, perhaps I could just throw in that Baroness Brown mentioned the National Risk Assessment and so on, and the Public Accounts Committee recently did a survey of the national risk and response to emergencies, and I think in that evidence it was discussed the fact that longer-term risks were beginning to be ingested into those security risks.
I had a note here about catastrophic wildfire events, that we don't have a place within the structure for responsibility for that. Is that right? Have I got that right? That in other jurisdictions and other countries and so forth, there is a designated department for wildfire, and thankfully we haven't had any major problems. But yeah, what can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I think it's not one of the things that people think about when they think about UK climate risk, but the evidence does show that the kinds of weather conditions that are conducive to wildfires will increase, particularly in the middle of the summers going forward. And in recent years, we have seen significant increases in the amount of areas that are burned by wildfire events, often on moorland and things like that. And yeah, I think because of that history, we're maybe not as well tuned into thinking about how we combat it in the UK. It's quite a cross-cutting area too, because there's health impacts to it, there's agricultural impacts, there's lots of different facets to it. It's something that I know the Home Office is thinking about, in terms of the emergency response side of it. So I think it's starting to rise up the agenda in the UK, but I think it's fair to say that it's one of the areas that's still nascent and where we'll need to do more work to have a fully planned out response for the kinds of weather conditions that might be conducive to wildfires that we'll see in decades ahead.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to firstly declare that I am quite emotional because of the fact that many of my constituents following Storm Henk have not yet recovered. 4 months on, they're not yet back in their homes in an inner city urban area that is Leicester East. And so this was shocking at the time. Homes on 4 feet underwater, and nobody is prepared, no adaptations in place. I just wanted to ask Baroness Brown, what is your assessment of the UK government's plans to adapt to climate change, specifically in the context of security risks?
Well, our most recent assessment we did this year of the third National Adaptation Programme is that we feel it falls way short of what is needed. And we would start by saying it doesn't provide a clear vision with goals and outcomes. It's a collection of information that's come from various government departments, but it's not an integrated set of ambitious plans. It doesn't have strong governance. it doesn't have it doesn't have the right metrics for us to be looking at progress. As we've highlighted, it doesn't identify how we are going to get the funding. And as we've heard, it needs to be aligned with Treasury spending reviews, but also with the cost reviews that the critical infrastructure providers, the regulators of the critical infrastructure providers do. It needs to be aligned with their cost and spending periods. But crucially, it needs target and monitoring, and it really needs a focus on cross-government delivery. And it's missing most of those things. Until we get that, it will be really difficult to say that we're making proper progress.
Indeed, in your in the Climate Change Committee's report assessment of the government's third National Adaptation Programme, not only do you say that it lacks the pace and ambition to address growing climate risk, the UK has lost its place as a leader in climate adaptation, but you call for an urgent refresh of the programme and of adaptation governance in the new Parliament. With specific reference to climate change and security, what, in your view, what updates to the third National Adaptation Programme and governance arrangements do you recommend? And this is a report that only came out in March of this year.
Well, we would like to see a review of the governance, and I say my personal view is I would like to see an overview coming from Cabinet Office, but there are a number of things government could look at. I think the Institute for Government laid out a wide range of options. We have seen a new committee of senior civil servants, which is supposed to be meeting, which is a National Resilience Committee. That sounds like a good but modest step in the right direction. But really, we think we need to see the government starting to set goals for where we need to be by, for example, mid-century. And we're now seeing that Germany has legislation which is putting in binding targets for adaptation. The Canadian adaptation strategy has measurable targets in it. We're seeing funding commitments for adaptation in the USA. So whilst we were ahead of the game with the Climate Change Act, on the adaptation side, we are now seeing a lot of other governments internationally moving ahead of us and starting to set targets and put real funding in place to deliver them. And that's where we need to get to in the UK.
What's your assessment of the funding for adaptation, the UK funding for adaptation, both in terms of UK territories and overseas?
We don't cover the overseas territories, so I'm afraid I can't comment on that. That's not something I know about. Overseas funding, clearly we do provide funding for overseas countries through the FCDO. Richard, you pick up from there. You've got the notes to hand.
Yeah, so the thing is, the first panel talked about, so much of this is part of connected global linkages between countries, so impacts that are happening elsewhere in the world have impacts here in the UK through global markets, through trade flows, etc. So the committee has always been clear that doing the UK's part in tackling climate change means preparing domestically, both reducing emissions and adapting here, but also doing our bit to help the world decarbonise and adapt, which will in turn help reduce those risks to the UK. So yeah, we think it's important that the funding commitments that we've made in the UK are delivered and targeted well to ensure those do deliver resilience on the ground as elsewhere in the world. And that should continue to be an important part of the UK strategy, particularly as we move out of the period where we've been the host of the COPs. Many of those initiatives that we championed during our hosting of the COPs, ensuring that we remain involved in seeing those deliver, make real progress in helping improve global climate resilience will be in our interest as well as the world's.
Perhaps I could add that we have done as a country, some impressive things. I mean, we now have a long-standing relationship with the Chinese Academy, looking at helping the Chinese with their adaptation planning. And I think that's been funded by the FCDO now for a number of years and has been coordinated by Chatham House. And I think, maintaining those sorts of links are hugely important to the UK's influence and the UK's ability to persuade countries that, some would perceive as not moving very fast about the importance of them moving fast on climate change as well.
Mm. I mean, well, let's. Can I just move? I mean, there's more I could say in terms of global South countries, but I won't indulge. I know that we have a shortage of time. But let me just move to my final question. To maybe, if I can ask Mr. Belcher, if I might ask you. Would you say that there is sufficient information available on adaptation, particularly at the local level, that would help to make tailored decisions about climate change adaptation?
The role of the Met Office is to supply the data and the expertise to help make decisions about impacts and adaptation. Certainly, as Baroness Brown alluded to earlier, adaptation, of course, one can think of at a national scale, but it usually gets down to a very local, place-based scale. So one of the initiatives the Met Office has led is to provide a data portal to enable access of data of that sort. But I would repeat my point earlier. At the moment, the Met Office does its best to provide an authoritative voice on this data, but there is no kite marking or standards for this. And maybe I could even add to that and say the World Meteorological Organization suggests that every nation has a national framework for climate services. So climate services are really what we're talking about, actually using the information to make advice and do the adaptation you're speaking to. At the moment, the UK does not have a national framework for climate services. Such a thing would provide standards on data. It would provide convening power to get experts together, possibly even stimulate small businesses to get into this area, particularly in the place-based side of things.
Can I just ask one final question? I started in my questions by highlighting the devastating impact in my constituency of Leicester East. If we'd had such source and resource, I tend to wonder if my constituent who died 2 weeks after having been moved from their home in their 70s, leaving their wife in their 70s still sofa surfing, if they'd had that information at a local level, whether they could have planned or at least help the local authority to plan better, to help constituents to be able to be better able to respond to such difficulties.
I think what you've illustrated there is the way that climate change really does touch upon people, and sadly there are many stories of that type that we could relate. So yes, given my role, I would say everyone having access to the right information and understanding the quality of that data and indeed the advice that sits behind it is really key to this question.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, Lewis.
Thank you very much, Chair. If I can ask the panel, in your view, very briefly, if you could, each of you, what you believe the foundations that are required to build a coordinated cross-government strategy with long-term outcomes for addressing climate security risks, starting with Richard.
Yes, absolutely. So as part of our recent report, we set out what we saw as 6 key asks for what a high ambition strategy looks like. Many of those have been touched on already. Vision is the first key one, which we've talked about several times, of an understanding of what we're trying to achieve with adaptation, to be able to set targets against and to track progress properly against. Ambition, we know that we need more commitments in the UK. Just packaging together existing initiatives is not going to be enough, and we want to see more new commitments to really tackle these adaptation deficits that the evidence focuses on. Delivery, we've talked about that increasing consideration of adaptation in planning, but I think what we really need to now move from just considering it in planning to actually delivering the changes in resilience on the ground. Responding to all the different risks. There are many bits of climate change and many aspects of those risks, several of which we're getting into today, and making sure we're considering casting the net wide, really, in responding to them. And the final 2 really are going further than we have to date in being able to monitor and track what we're doing so we can learn and adjust plans when we figure out what works on the ground. We're doing not enough of that at the moment. We don't quite have the structures in place to do it. And the final one is making this a continual programme, something that we continue to develop, work on and improve over time through the rollout of adaptation, both the national programmes and local delivery, because we know that doing this once every 5 years it is not going to be enough really to respond to the urgency of the evidence highlights for the climate challenge to the UK.
I think we also absolutely support all of that. I would like to see, as our previous panel talked about, adaptation to climate change being a consideration that has to be thought of in every policy and every piece of legislation. I think we do need to get everybody thinking about it and embed it right across everything we do. And I do think we should emphasise, in response to what you said, the very important role of local government, and that local government needs to be properly funded, because weather is intrinsically local. Other conditions are local, whether it's farmland, whether there are lots of trees, whether it's a very built-up area. These are all actually local issues that interact with the climate to cause problems. And of course, as again we heard in the last session, the impacts of climate change are both about the severity of the weather that is there, but they're also about the vulnerability of the communities or the infrastructure that it is impacting with. And of course, it is local authorities who know where the care homes are, who know where the poorer parts, where the social housing is, where there are people who are likely to need more support. So both in terms of actually response when there is a problem, but also in terms of having to decide how do we prioritise investment. Actually, it's for many of the issues we need to look at, it will be local authorities who know best where to make those prioritisation decisions.
Good. Anyone else like to comment?
I won't repeat what's been said already. What I would emphasise from the point of view of infrastructure is how adaptation needs to become embedded within the existing processes, working practices of utility companies, so water, energy, telecommunications and so on. So we've talked, and Baroness Brown has talked about the need for the overarching perspective. That needs to be powerful, but I think it can be quite light. The legwork is done within the delivery organisations, and that really needs to be part of the day job. It has to be integrated within the asset management cycles. So more emphasis, for example, on maintenance, which we're not seeing, for example, in the flood risk management area. The NAO observed that the Environment Agency was underspending on maintenance, and maintenance is so important to adaptation. The other thing I would emphasise is the importance of stress tests and exercises. Thinking through all of the plausible shocks which your systems might be exposed to, bringing people together round the table to war game them out, scenario them out, and then learning lessons and making sure that those lessons are taken up in practice.
I'll just add one thing, which is we haven't really yet had a conversation with the public about what they want from their infrastructure in the long term in terms of the standards of service, and that needs the costs that we were talking about earlier as well.
Well, that leads on to my next set of questions, really, and I think the term delivery mechanisms, it kind of encapsulates this. So, listening to you, food, water, and land use are kind of three of the key areas. If we can look at water and land, on land, we know that when it comes to, I think it's 60% of the kind of key biggest carbon sinks. So 60% of the land that's used for the kind of two biggest carbon sinks, which are forests and deep peat, they're owned by 1,200 people. So when we look at, and those people get to decide how those carbon sinks are used. So those 1,200 people have a disproportionate impact on policy and policy delivery and the mechanisms in which we can do that. On water, we know that we have delivery mechanisms which are broken. we have to look at Thames Water. And we know, for example, that with Thames Water in England, they've accrued debts of 64 billion and yet paid out 78 billion pounds in dividends. And how have they funded their capital expenditure? They've done that through basically the bills that we pay. They haven't actually borrowed anything to invest. They've only borrowed to pay dividends. So the mechanisms themselves are broken. And I guess the question I want to ask you is, in politics, we're all very ideological. We're told that we're ideological. But surely, with an existential threat coming our way, shouldn't we be using mechanisms that work rather than tying ourselves to ideological concepts because that's what's in our political manifesto or was done 30 or 40 years ago because someone said it was a good idea, but clearly it isn't. And I'm really interested on water and land. That when we look at the reforms that are required in terms of because no one's mentioned this. It's like talking about a football team and saying, I want my team to win, but not talking about the players and their form and whether you're going to be using 4-4-2. You're just talking about, I want to win. What about the actual delivery mechanism? Surely we need to get away from the ideology of this and start looking at what models of delivery actually work. Anyone want to comment on that? I'll pick someone.
Well, I wondered if Jim might want to say something about water, and I'll say something about land. But
go ahead.
I'm not sure we have. I'm not sure we have the answers for you. But I would say we do urgently need in this country a land use strategy. There's a lot of competition for things we want to do with our land. We want to grow more trees to take CO2 out of the atmosphere, which is going to be a hugely important thing to do. We also want to preserve our peat so that it doesn't release more CO2 into the atmosphere. We want to grow more food so that we have greater food security. We want to expand. We want to build more houses for a growing population and to make sure young people can afford new homes. And whilst it's nice to think you can leave all this to markets to do because they all understand what's needed, I think we need a much more strategic approach to actually deciding what it is we are going to do where, and then it's only then you are able to put the policy mechanisms in place that can encourage or ensure that this mixed group of owners actually deliver what we need for the UK.
I agree with you.
Probably more idealistic than you are.
No, I agree with you. But I guess what I'm thinking here is that what you've said makes complete sense. But when we consider that 1 million acres in this country are owned by 24 dukes, okay, 30% of the land in this country is owned by the aristocracy and landed gentry. I'm not being a class warrior here. I'm just being a hard-headed pragmatist and thinking to myself, if 60% of those forests and peat bogs and peat, that deep peat, is on private land where those people get to choose how it's used, then what we're leaving ourselves with is a very small piece of the pie to take up all of the necessity, all of the activity that's required to get us into the zone where we have adapted ourselves and given ourselves the ability to be able to weather what is an existential risk in terms of food security, water security, land use, carbon sinks. And so we're kind of tying not just one arm behind our back, but one arm and one of our legs and probably the other leg as well. And it doesn't work out so well if you tie both legs behind your back. So I'm trying not to be ideological here, but I know I will sound like a class warrior. But it feels to me...
And you wouldn't have total agreement across the committee either.
But it feels to me that what we're not talking about here is the delivery mechanisms, and some of them simply aren't working. And the systems that we have in place in this country for the existential risk that is coming down the path at us simply are not fit for purpose. And I just wonder whether there's any understanding from the experts on this panel that you feel that's something that you can speak up on and say, yes, we do need reform in this country when it comes to some of these issues.
So if I might comment on water, we know how to plan water resources for a changing climate. We know how we should, for example, design urban drainage systems, and the water companies are responsible for the underground pipes. The National Infrastructure Commission produced a report on surface water flooding. So the both how you plan for a changing climate and how you design and implement systems which can cope better with a changing climate is all well known, and that can be done by whatever form of entity owns or is responsible for those infrastructures. So in that sense, the Commission is agnostic. The one thing I would say, however, is that within the Commission we look at both public investment infrastructure and privately owned and privately financed infrastructure. And what happens with companies like Thames Water will have potential impacts in terms of finance of other forms of privately financed infrastructure across the country. So it is well, perhaps it's a truism to say that this is a matter of considerable concern.
I think we're coming on to water tomorrow, so we will delve further into this. But I have no further questions, Chair. Thank you.
I just had a very brief
addition
to your point. So I think what you've highlighted is the close relationship between the drive to net zero and adaptation to climate change. And the land use, as Baroness Brown described, is a very good illustration of that. And so keeping adaptation right in the forefront of our minds is clearly very important for that reason.
Thank you.
Right. Very quickly, I'm just going to round off because you didn't actually pick up the questions here at the end. I think, Seriously, what's your assessment, I think particularly an NIC assessment of the way in which climate change is going to affect the UK's economic security?
Yeah, I'm hesitating here because actually the evidence on a macro scale, what is climate change going to do to GDP in this country, is quite incomplete. And perhaps you won't be surprised to say we have a big and diversified economy. We've been subject to some very major losses, flooding, possibly £1 billion a year on average is the Environment Agency's estimate. But within the overall scale of GDP, that hasn't come up in the figures. So, but if we look ahead and at the possibility of shocks, which, as we've discussed, cascade through infrastructure, through supply chains, then there is the possibility of much more significant impacts. I think there needs to be more evidence and analysis in terms of what the scale of those impacts are. I mean, in the previous session, there was more talk about vulnerable countries around the world, and in those places we are seeing more significant macroeconomic impacts from climate change. In a sense, we've been fortunate in this country up to now, notwithstanding all of the extremely harmful impacts which we've heard about from this committee.
Ms. Brown, any final thoughts from you on
this?
Could
I add a few thoughts on that? We have on a number of occasions attempted to look at this on the Adaptation Committee, but the data and the evidence is not yet, and the analysis is not yet there for this. We do, the work we did for CCRA 3 suggests that the number of individual risks, which are going to have very high annual damages, the things in the order of billions per annum, we're likely to something like triple if we reach 2 degrees of warming, and we're quite well on the way to that, sadly, at the moment. But I think it's also important to recognise that not all of the impacts are very obviously visible. I was talking to an expert on food security the other day, and she said that for some of our fresh foods, that something like 40% of the recent food inflation has actually been climate related, not necessarily in this country, but overseas. So there's climate impacting all sorts of things. And of course, food inflation has been an enormous driver of our current economic situation. So some of these things, as Jim was saying, are extremely hard to analyse at the moment and to understand where we need to be gathering all the data from. But it is undoubtedly becoming more and more clear that it is having significant economic impacts.
Good, thank you. Well, we need to draw things to a close now. Thank you very much to all five of you for your very helpful contributions and for your time. It is much appreciated. Thank you to the committee. I declare the meeting closed. Order.
The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended.